don't know if you guys can hear that. But that is some turbo shaft play right there, which is not necessarily good. What is going on today, guys? My name's Alex. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about 5 common issues with the 6.7 Cummins engine, as well as a 6th bonus issue. And if you guys have a 5th gen truck with a 6.7 Cummins, I'd stick around to the end because I think it is an important issue that you guys should know about. So let's just pop the hood here. Well, that's not a 6.7 Cummins. Just kidding, guys. Obviously, if you guys have been following the channel, you know this is my Power Wagon with the 6.4 Hemi, not the 6.7 Cummins. However, I do work at a fleet with about 150 plus school buses that run the 6.7 Cummins engine. So we get to see a lot of failures, and I thought I would share some info with you guys. So here we have one of the oldest buses in our fleet here. This is a 2011, and this is one of our newest with the 6.7 Cummins. This is a 2021. So we do get to see obviously the newer buses, and we have a lot of experience with the 6.7 Cummins engine. Now, comparing these ISB 6.7s to the Ram pickup truck engines, they are very, very similar. There are a little bit of differences. However, what we're going to talk about not only includes obviously these engines, but the engines in a Ram 2500 or 3500 pickup truck. So the first common issue with these 6.7 Cummins is DPFs clogging. Now, DPFs were introduced in 2007. Basically what they do is they capture the soot or the ash produced by a diesel engine. That's their job. And these engines are prone to having those filters clog up. So initially Chrysler opted out of using an SCR canister, which basically means that in order to reduce NOx without an SCR, the engine has to run pretty rich. The result is that the engine gets pretty sooty and those filters kind of get clogged. Now that's up to 2013. So if your truck is 2013 and above, you're less likely to have this issue. However, I can say firsthand, we have quite a few buses that come up with clogged DPFs. So it is still kind of an issue. So the after treatment system can be a little complicated, but let me just show you the bare bone basics here. So under our older bus here, this is our DPF filter. It does not have an SCR canister or DEF, diesel exhaust fluid. If it did, it would be sort of down here. So this is what tends to clog. This is what collects a lot of the ash. Now, obviously, if you have a Ram truck, the after treatment system may be a little bit different. However, the problem is the same. For whatever reason, these engines here just like to run very sooty. And we'll talk about the EGR a little bit later. It tends to get all sooted up as well. So some of the symptoms of having a clogged DPF will be power loss, long crank time, some check engine lights, and then eventually, if the problem does not get solved, you'll end up derating this engine, which, you know, just is not a good situation. Now, there are ways to prevent clogging DPF filters. The best way is to drive your truck a long distance. If you drive your truck 5 kilometers to work every day, the DPF is nowhere near getting up to temperature, so it can't burn off any of that soot, and you're more than likely going to end up with a clogged DPF. So it is important to drive the 6.7 Cummins pretty frequently, get that after treatment system up to temperature, and you'll reduce the likelihood of having a clogged DPF. So the number 2 most common issue that we run across is turbo problems. Now, not necessarily full-on turbo implosions, more or less just turbo issues. So the most common one we see is the turbo drain leaking or oil feed leaking. We also see a lot of VGT problems, which either the VGT is sticking or the actual actuator itself just fails. Excess play on the actual turbo shaft is another issue we find. So this is actually a turbo I replaced pretty recently on a 6.7 Cummins. The problem with this turbo is that the actuator was very stiff, and you can see that's the line it should end up going to, and it just does not want to get there. So the VGT is seized somewhere in the internals, you know, the turbo's junk. So that is an issue right there. Also, if we spin this girl around, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that is some turbo shaft play right there, which is not necessarily good. It's not the worst, it's probably acceptable, you probably run that, but there is some play there. Now in terms of oil leakage, this is the bottom of the turbo. Now this drain, for whatever reason, tends to leak quite a bit. Not really sure why. It's not the end of the world. You know, we tend to let them just run unless it's, you know, dripping on the floor, but they do tend to leak here. So right here we have a brand new turbo, and as you guys can see, it's able to go all the way across to their indent here, which means the VGT component is not seized. Now, VGT is variable geometry turbo. Now, variable geometry turbo kind of acts like a small turbo and a big turbo all in one. You know, right when you're at the low RPMs, in order to spool up quickly, the fins are closed, and then as you gain RPM, the fins open up and kind of act like a bigger turbo. So that's the gist behind a VGT turbo. However, these moving fins here and this actuator, there's an actuator actually plated to this, can fail, and these fins can actually seize up in there because this engine is so sooty. So that's what I mean by VGT turbo seizing. So how can you tell if your turbo is failing? Well, if you have an oil leak, it's pretty obvious. You should see some oil. If the VGT actuator isn't working in some capacity, it should be pretty obvious. You'll either have some really low power and probably throw some pretty significant check engine lights. Now, the best way to prevent turbo damage is you know, to let the truck warm up a little bit. These turbos spin at like 100,000 RPM, so they are spinning extremely fast. And if you put pressure on a cold turbo, you know, that's just not good for it. Another really important thing is to let your truck idle down. So what do I mean by that? So when you get home and you're in your driveway, just let your truck idle for maybe like 20-30 seconds, and that will bring the turbo RPMs way down. And when you turn your engine off, the turbo won't be spinning as fast. So what can happen is if you just pull into your driveway real quick and turn the engine off, your turbo is still spinning really fast. And with the engine off, there's no oil feed going to your turbo, so that turbo is spinning without any oil feed, and you're just gonna burn up the bearings in there very fast, which is gonna lead to a lot of turbine play there, which is not what you want. So always remember, just let your truck idle down for like 20 to 30 seconds when you get home, and that should really help the life of your turbo. Figured I'd give you guys an example. So I'll bring this thing up to maybe like 1200, 1500 RPM, and I'll actually just shut it off. And I got my big camera here with the microphone, so you should be able to pick up hearing that turbo still just spooling away with no oil feed to it. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, you really just want to let the truck idle down a little bit, and that'll really increase the life of your turbo, which is always good. So common issue number 3, I thought I would touch on this because I think it's interesting. A lot of people say the 6.7 has a head gasket failure issue. Now, we have never actually had a head gasket failure since I've worked here, and we have a lot of buses, and we've just never had a 6.7 head gasket failure in that time. So I'm going to go on a limb here and say that it's potentially a little bit of an overblown problem. It does happen, and I think that has to do with the fact that the 6.7 is just putting out a lot of power, a lot of torque, and you know, I think that kind of goes in line with potential head gasket failures. However, the reason why I think people like to point out that issue is because the previous engine, the 5.9 Cummins, was an absolute dynamite engine and rarely ever had head gasket issues. So I think that's why people kind of point to this engine having head gasket issues, even though I don't think it's that common. It does seem to happen a lot more than the 5.9. So common symptoms of having head gasket failure: blowing white smoke out the exhaust. Now I know that's much harder to tell with all the after treatment system. It tends to just kind of blank all that out. You may see some oil in the coolant or some coolant in the oil, one or the other, and that's a pretty good sign of a head gasket failure there. The number 4 common issue we see with these engines is fuel dilution in the oil, meaning basically there's fuel in the oil. Now, how does it get there? Well, it gets there when these engines do what's called a regen. So we talked about earlier a clogged DPF. So when the bus senses that the filters are starting to get clogged, it will tell the driver this truck needs to have a regen to hopefully burn off all the ash and keep those filters nice and clean. So when the engine does that, it needs to have a lot of heat going into that DPF. So some engines, what they do is they actually stuff an injector into the exhaust pipe here, usually right behind the turbo, and it actually injects raw fuel down the exhaust to help burn off that DPF, burn that soot off. So that's what some engines do. Cummins does not do that. What they do is they put fuel in the actual engine itself when you are in exhaust stroke. So obviously the gases are leaving the engine and there's a little spray of fuel through the injector and it goes right out into the DPF. So it works fine. But what can happen when the fuel is injected and not burned, it can potentially run down the cylinder wall and get into the oil, therefore diluting the oil with diesel fuel. And what that does is it means that the oil itself no longer becomes as lubricating and therefore can actually ruin your bearings. It can ruin a lot of things in the engine. Now, Cummins says fuel dilution up to 5% in the oil is not a problem. However, once you get over that point, you do run into issues like premature main bearing wear and just really not fun stuff. So that is an issue to look out for. The best way to avoid fuel dilution is to avoid a lot of regens. Now, the best way to avoid a lot of regens is to drive the truck. Avoid idling times. A lot of idle times really just soots up these engines. These school buses, they have a lot of idle time on it and they get so sooted it's not even funny. So, the best thing to do is just drive these trucks and limit your idling time. Like I said, if you are planning on driving this truck 5 kilometers, 5 miles to work every day and back and not heating up the engine properly, you are just going to run into a lot of problems, and I would highly reconsider the option of buying a diesel truck if you are planning to use it like that. Issue number 5, and this is actually pretty common for us with these engines, is the EGR cooler as well as the EGR flap, which is right here. So let me go to the other side here and talk about the EGR cooler. So once again, we were talking about emissions components. This is your EGR cooler right here. Basically, exhaust gases come up, get cooled through here, through engine coolant, and then get sent over into the intake and go back out through. So anyways, this EGR cooler tends to get clogged up with crap. It also tends to leak quite a bit. Like I said, there's coolant that actually cools these exhaust gases, and sometimes those leak and then raw coolant is just being fed into the intake. Not a good situation. And we do, like I said, have a lot of problems with these EGR coolers. We also have a lot of problems with those EGR flaps right there. So here's an EGR that we replaced pretty recently. And if you guys can see in there, look how sooted up that crap is. So all those fins there, that's where the coolant runs through and cools the gases, but it's just so sooted up in there. And that's what ended up actually making this EGR cooler fail. So this right here is your EGR valve. Like I mentioned, this kind of comes around and this is what takes the EGR gases and puts it in your intake. This controls how much EGR gas is actually getting put into the engine. However, we have had a lot of problems with these. Basically what we do is we take this whole thing off, we clean it out, and there are small little holes or galleries in here that just get completely carboned up, where we have to take a drill bit and actually drill all the carbon out of it because these engines just get so carboned up or sooted up. These are a large problem with our buses in terms of the trucks themselves. They're not as big of an issue because most people with their pickup trucks do not idle as much as our school buses do. The best thing you can do for your EGR to keep your EGR working properly is to make sure you limit your idle time and you get the engine up to temperature. A cold engine tends to produce a lot more soot, and if the engine never gets up to temperature, well, you're just going to produce a lot of soot, and it's just not going to be a good thing for these components, and they are usually not the cheapest. So those are the 5 common issues that we see with our 6.7s in our fleet here. I can say hands down, these are the best engines in our fleet. We have a couple of Max Force engines, 6.4 engines, which is basically a Power Stroke 6.4. Absolute garbage for this application. They just do not last, and they suck. They just do. We also have a Detroit diesel 5-liter. They're brand new engines, and we've already had to replace one. The other ones are all really consuming a lot of oil, which is scary. We've just had a lot of problems with those DD5s. So in terms of our fleet, these 6.7 Cummins ISBs are by far the best engine in our fleet. They just seem to last. They can get beat on. We idle them all winter, and I would say they're pretty reliable despite the issues I mentioned. So back to our 5th gen trucks here. Like I said, we'll talk about our bonus 6th issue here, and I think it's a pretty big one. It's the CP4 high pressure fuel pumps. Between 2003 and 2018, Cummins ran a CP3 fuel pump, and it was very successful, worked very well, very little complaints about it. However, starting in 2019 and plus with the 5th gen trucks, Cummins has switched to the CP4 fuel pumps for the Ram trucks. Now, they probably switched to that pump because it is a lighter unit, as well as it's probably cheaper to manufacture. So some of you guys may remember the Duramax is having huge fuel problems between like 2011 and like 2016. And there's actually a class action lawsuit against Chevy because of this. And what fuel pumps were they running? They were running CP4 fuel pumps. However, those Duramaxes didn't have lift pumps, and that may contribute to the issue, but I think the main issue is the fact they were running CP4 fuel pumps, and it basically grenaded a lot of fuel systems on Chevy trucks, and that resulted in like $10,000 worth of repairs, which is, so for whatever reason, Ram and Cummins have decided to throw the CP4 into their newer 6.7 Cummins, and I worry that there will be some fuel system problems in the future here. Now, a diesel fueling system is much different than a gasoline system. Typically, a diesel fueling system runs at anywhere from like 20 to 30,000 PSI, where a gas fueling system runs at like, I don't know, 100 PSI. So, you know, the tolerances on a high pressure fuel pump for a diesel engine are very small, and even the slightest issues can result in a lot of damage. Now, the rumor is that a CP4 pump is made for low sulfur fuel, and here in North America we run what's called ultra low sulfur fuel. So the sulfur in the fuel tends to act as a lubricant, and the CP4 pump needs that sulfur to be lubricated, and without it, it tends to fail. So basically, with the lack of lubrication, what happens is small metal shavings from the pump start to wear away, and they go through the whole fueling system, go through your injectors, and when it becomes enough of a problem, you end up having to replace your whole fuel system. So injectors, fuel pump, it's lines, it's a very costly thing. This is why it's kind of confusing to me why Cummins and Ram switched to the CP4 pump, knowing what happened to the Duramaxes between 2011 and 2016 with all those fueling issues. I'm not really sure. I haven't heard of any updates to the CP4 pump. And if I was to own a Cummins truck that was, 2019 and above, I would be a little bit nervous having a CP4 fuel pump. Now, the best thing you can probably do is to make sure you get your fuel from a reputable source. Good fuel is always a good thing, and make sure you change your fuel filters on your Cummins very frequently. I know what we do is we change our fuel filters every oil change, which is roughly, I think, 24,000 K is what Cummins recommends. So, you know, whatever that becomes, maybe twice a year, change your fuel filters, spend the money. It's going to be worth it. There are kits made and available that can allow you to switch back to the CP3 pump. It is a heavier unit. However, personally, I think it's a much more reliable unit. You know, we're starting to hear rumors that anywhere from, 100,000 miles and up, we start to see failures on these CP4 pumps, and it is a very expensive repair. So if you guys own a 5th gen Ram Cummins, just beware about your fuel pump. Make sure you get good fuel and make sure you're changing your fuel filters frequently enough, because the last thing you want is to have to replace your whole fuel system. Anyways, guys, that's my 2 cents on common problems with the 6.7 Cummins. If you guys have had any other problems with your Cummins, feel free to drop a comment down below. Would love to hear from you guys as always. But it does seem like a lot of the problems are simply just because of the after treatment system. And like I mentioned earlier, every manufacturer is going to be running into those problems. So it's not just a Cummins thing. And unfortunately, it just seems like it's an industry thing. The best thing you can do for your truck, it seems, is to drive it and make sure that engine gets hot. And you're probably going to eliminate a lot of those problems. And you'll probably see a nice healthy engine for 200, 300,000 miles. And, that's what we all want to see. But as always, if you guys like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe. We'd love to have you guys on board. We got a big tow plan for this Power Wagon. We're moving out to New Brunswick. Lots of cool off-roading stuff, so that should be exciting. But enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video.